Oh, is that what's been going on? Oh, that makes so much sense out of my experience. Slightly more sympathetically, I think this has great promise. This was Michael Carroll's innovation, innovation, and both Carmen and I have found it both challenging, trying to keep track of which metaphors have already been presented to which group, of course, is a trivial detail about a larger issue of us keeping track of the development of each group, which is, of course, quite different kinds of issues about what patterns and what level of sophistication, how transparent, how much of this so-called ethical deceit that is hiding the more complex parts initially so people can replicate the parts that actually get the results, and then refining by slowly revealing the more complex parts as we do additional demonstrations. I like it. I think it's a fine innovation. In this particular case, as I think you're well aware, I originally started with a guess, which I wasn't very much committed to, that the extra benefit of the parallel would be that the trainers could then mentor and guide and coach the practitioners through the basic patterns at the same time using presentation skill modules, metaphors, demonstrations, exercises, design, and so forth, to stimulate the practitioner's assimilation of the material. And that happened. But even more striking was the fact that the feedback, direct, nonverbal and verbal, from the practitioners to the candidate trainers has pushed those trainers into requirements which they might not otherwise have identified. Let me say it this way. There are two standard forms in the NLP world and more generally in training. The modular approach, where you break a complex class of patterns into relatively coherent subsets, present 3 or 4 days at a time. There's a month goes by where people go out in the world and have real experience, bounce off of the world, collide with the realities of the actual application, and then they come back with really profound questions, really well-honed kinds of requests for guidance. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with that? And the disadvantage, of course, is you don't get the intensity that you get in a single run like we've done here. The disadvantage of the single run intensive, which we've been doing here, is it doesn't have that collision with the real world involved. But that's exactly what this design offers. Those trainers are constantly colliding with the requirements of the practitioners and vice versa. The practitioners are making nonverbal, especially, and sometimes verbal responses to the presentation of the trainers, which is immediate feedback for the trainers to alter their approach based on the calibrations they get. So I think that this design actually overcomes the only objection I've ever had to intensive programs, namely this constant evening collision between the two groups, the trainers, candidates, and the actual practitioners, has led to this collision, which is ongoing and has, I think, upgraded the performance of both groups. This overlaps slightly with a comment I made previously, namely the two designs when you run separately trainers training or a practitioner or a master practitioner, you still have the option. Do you do it in an intensive, continuous run at this thing, or do you do it in modules? And as I mentioned before, the primary difference that I detect in running these in parallel is that it overcomes the only single difficulty that I perceive with intensive mass practice, the intensive form. And that is, in a modular form, between presentation, different patterns, people have an opportunity to go out into the world and actually discover what happens with naive people, with people who don't share the presuppositions, which are largely shared by the self-selecting group that attends these events. And therefore, this collision with the real world, or at least as we experience it, leads to refinements, questions, which are extremely useful. And so by running these two tracks in parallel, it overcomes the one disadvantage of an intensive format. By evening sessions, as you're well aware, the trainers, candidates, and the practitioners bump up against each other, and by this collision create a higher standard through calibration for both groups. This is the primary advantage, and it's quite satisfying to participate in it. There's an extra sort of part of the requirement for the trainers involved, since we bounce between groups, keeping track of what's happened where. Of course, calibration will tell you what's relevant, but in terms of the overall design, fortunately, John Thompson at the level of the practitioner and Michael Carroll at the level of the trainers group have done an excellent job about keeping us on track on relevancy. And so that's worked out quite nicely. There's been an interesting contamination in this one. We began both of these seminars with a 3-day standalone modeling workshop in which we had 5 different models. The entire intention, the only purpose of this modeling workshop was to cover the first 3 of the 5 steps in what we refer to as a model of NLP modeling, presented in Whispering in the Wind. That is, we selected the geniuses. That is, we had adroit performers and everything from Thai kickboxing to cartoons. And that's the content of the course. The sole purpose of this course is to cover the first 3 steps, which is the unconscious assimilation of the pattern and practice to criteria in a parallel context to make sure that you have assimilated the patterns. I very much like these kinds of seminars. The thing that's striking to me about these groups, which is quite unique, is that I would say roughly 50% of the trainers and 50% of the practitioners went through that know-nothing state. That is, the sole purpose was, and they succeeded, most of them at least, in developing the choice of suspending access to their knowledge base, tacit and explicit. And by so doing, removing largely the filters which are impediments to the assimilation of new patterning, new possibilities in the world. The contamination effect is that half of the people were slipping in the practitioner or the trainer, were slipping repetitively by choice into these know-nothing states to assimilate. For example, when I was doing a demonstration, it was very clear to me that the majority of the trainers and the majority of the practitioners had shifted state, and we're in a know-nothing state, simply assimilating by micro-muscle movement and repetition with internal voice the demonstration that I was offering. That's why I offered multiple demonstrations. This is part of a discovery process which is, I think, essential to excellent learning. The contamination effect was because of rapport, both at individuals with individuals and at the group level. When such a large number of the practitioners and candidate trainers shifted into know-nothing states, they dragged the group along to some degree, not maybe with the same precision, maybe not with the same complete suspension of access to previous understandings and learnings, but the effect was quite profound in terms of, I don't know if you yourself noticed, but in this particular episode, we had to reactivate people to get questions from them. In the know-nothing state, verbal transactions like that are inappropriate. Part of the choice which came out of the modeling 3 days was the voluntary ability to step in and out of these so-called know-nothing states. And it had an immediate effect from day one, both in terms of contaminating in the most positive possible sense, a virus which spread through the group, and inducing other people into the same set of choices. And on the other side, it was amusing to me that there were hardly any questions at the beginning. We had to rebuild the capacity of people to pop out long enough to formulate a question from a third, and then pop back in if in fact they want to assimilate the answer in one of those know-nothing states.